Welcome to our second hearing of the Presidential Commission on Election Administration. My name is Ginsberg. I'm the co-chairman along with Bob Bauer of this group. We very much appreciate your attendance and your comments today. As you know, the President propounded an executive order with 10 topics, which we are seeking your input on. On behalf of the Commission, we have many questions that we would like to ask you, so we will be a little brutal in enforcing the 5 to 8 minute time remarks for all of you. We do want a dialogue because we found that's really what is most helpful to us in trying to get to the bottom of the problems that exist and to propound the best practices, which is the goal of our Commission. So thank you again for joining us, and let me turn it over to Bob.
Yes, thank you. We appreciate also the written submissions we've received, so we have come armed with questions. We have an 8-minute segment here for each of our witnesses this morning, and the yellow light comes on when there are 3 minutes remaining and the time has come to sum up. And then we really will open it up to the commissioners, and we look forward to having a very robust discussion with you. The information that's been made available to the Commission through your testimony and the opportunity you've given us to ask questions is absolutely central to the work that we are trying to accomplish here. So let me join Ben in thanking you very much for coming and appreciate very much the help that you're providing us here today. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's begin with Secretary Gessler. Welcome.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for coming to Colorado, particularly Mr. Ginsberg and Mr. Bauer. We do appreciate your time here. So I'll talk a little bit about the Colorado experience and some of the things that we did that worked well, and hopefully some of the things we learned as well. After the 2012 election, we in Colorado, we think we did a fairly good job and have some things to talk about. Initially, we bucked the national trend in 2012. We actually saw a voter increase here in the state of Colorado, unlike most other states, including many of the battleground states as well. Our voter registration is at an all-time high, and our voter rolls were cleaner than they've ever been before. And we also implemented several programs that improved access and convenience for the voters and election administrators alike. Some of the things I'll be talking about, we've published in a 12-page white paper as well. It's available on our website. I'm happy to provide paper copies and other information for the Commission. I am not going to even dare read off the URL for that, so I'm happy to give that to you in writing. Let me talk a little bit about voter accessibility for our uniformed and overseas voters. So in 2012, Colorado, we issued almost 20% more ballots to UACAVA, uniform and overseas voters, than 4 years prior. We had substantial increases in the return rates, substantial increases in the count rates, the percentage that we counted. And as a result, we witnessed a 65% increase in the number of ballots for uniformed and overseas military voters. So that's almost a 2/3 increase in that number. So that was a big change, and I think a real contrast with a trend of slumping participation by overseas and military voters. So the 45-day requirement, as far as getting ballots out, in Colorado in advance of the election, plus Colorado has 8 days to count them if they are received 8 days after the election, but postmarked before the election. So that played some role. But I think we took additional steps that probably made a big difference. First of all, for 2012, we deployed a statewide electronic ballot delivery system. So we allowed voters to log in and electronically download their ballots beginning right at the 45-day mark before the election. So that dramatically increased the time for voters to return ballots. That's particularly important because oftentimes I will say that oftentimes the U.S. Postal Service is slow overseas, and sometimes foreign postal services are even slower. So we had more than 9,000 Colorado voters use that particular system in 2012. And 2012 was also the first year that military and overseas voters could sign up for UACAVA designation online, which bypassed the paper form and, again, some of the unreliable mail systems. So that was one thing we did. The second thing is we deployed high-speed ballot-on-demand printers to every single county in the state. So in Colorado, ballots are certified 57 days before the general election. So 57 days before the general election certification, 45-day mailing deadline. It's a very tight time frame. So this helped. Now, we received a grant from the military to be able to do that. It came in pretty late, to be honest with you. So although we deployed those printers, not all of our counties were able to use them, but nonetheless, those counties produced about 15,000 ballots, 14,987 to be exact, and sent over 4,300 ballots to military voters, 5,600 ballots to non-military overseas voters, and we also duplicated about 3,600 military and overseas ballots using that particular resource. So that was very important as well. The other thing that we did, and this applied both to military and also non-military, online voter registration. So in Colorado, you do have to have either a driver's license or a state ID, and well over 99% of our voters have one of those. Based on our analysis of the voting rolls, but military voters were able to use that as well when they're overseas, as long as they had an internet connection. So that happened as well. A couple other things we did. We did a voter registration outreach campaign in which we educated voters in two ways. One was educating them how to register to vote using our online system, as well as the deadlines and the requirements to be able to vote. And part of that too, though, is we also explained to voters, and we used TV, internet, print, and radio on this with this campaign, that about 1 in 8 registrations was incorrect. And so we asked people to come and either register to vote if they wanted to, and gave them the information, or to correct their information so that we would have more accurate voter rolls. So from September 1st to the October 9th deadline, a little over a month, not quite a month and a half, we had 230,000, almost 250,000 people use the online voter registration system for the first time. And of those, 43,000 were new registrations, and 187,000 of them were updates. So that really helped us in two ways, voter accessibility as well as election integrity as well. We did a lot with our online system, and along those lines, we mobile optimized the system for tablets and smartphones as well. We didn't use an application. Although we continue to analyze that, our sense was that applications are used by people more for recurring transactions over the internet. This was a one-time, for most people, a one-time transaction. Once every 2 years or so, they check their voter information. So we used a mobile optimized instead. And we thought that was very successful, our approach there. And then the other thing that we've done, and this is a consortium, there's two consortia in the country right now. One run out of Kansas. It started as a 4-state Midwestern consortium, and the ERIC project, which is pushed by the Pew Foundation. And that's they're both in slightly different forms data matching, and I'm sure you've probably heard of those. I think we're one of the few states we actually participate in both. And it helps us identify people who vote in 2 states at once, helps us identify people who are eligible but may not have registered yet, helps us identify people who are registered in more than one state as well. So it's really, I think, both of those have helped us substantially. They're really sort of just taking off. So in 2010, we had a few states that we were able to match with. 2012, this last election, was more. And it's expected to grow. So for example, the Kansas project, I think, is expected to increase to 27 states in the next election cycle. And I know that the ERIC project has added a few more states as well. So those are both very good trends as well. Overall, I think what we saw in Colorado is we saw a big increase in voter participation. I think we saw real improvements in our election integrity here as well, on both sides of that equation. And when it comes to the election administration as well, I know long lines was a big issue. For the most part, we did a very good job in the state of Colorado. I've been involved in elections either in a public or private capacity for over a dozen years. This was probably the smoothest election in my memory. That comports with the memories of folks in my staff as well. We don't have specific metrics on that that we were able to compare over time. We did have a few long lines in one of our counties. What we found, though, the challenge was that we had what are called vote centers. So basically anyone in that county could vote at any vote center. And so even though there were an adequate number of vote centers to reduce lines, what happened is private groups, and including political parties, basically through their education campaigns directed everyone to one of the main vote centers. And so that created congestion there. Sort of, if you think you've got 4 highways that all head in the same direction, and everyone chooses to use one highway, you're going to get congestion there. And so, sometimes a day we had a long wait at a particular vote center, maybe an hour to an hour and a half, whereas another vote center, which was 2 miles away, had just a few minutes of a waiting line. So over the course of the day, we were able to over the course of the day, we were able to sort of direct people to that. So that was the one thing that I think we've got to think a little bit more about in the future on how private groups, political parties as well, are going to respond to those choices when they have those levels of choices. And so I think that's one of the things that we need to work on a little bit because we had a few glitches. Overall, though, we think Colorado did a pretty good job. We always have more to learn. We always have ways to do a better job. But compared to the prior presidential election, just about every metric that one can imagine, we far exceeded what we had seen in the past. So I'm hopeful this is somewhat helpful to the Commission, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Well,
Next is Dean Logan, the Registrar, Recorder, and County Clerk from Los Angeles.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the Commission. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. My name is Dean Logan. I'm the Registrar of Voters for Los Angeles County. Los Angeles is the country's largest county election jurisdiction, covering an area of more than 4,000 square miles, serving 4.8 million registered voters. Our electorate is larger than that of the electorate in 42 of the 50 states. In November 2012, we staffed and supported more than 4,800 polling locations, recruited and trained more than 25,000 poll workers, issued nearly 2 million vote-by-mail ballots, and centrally tabulated 2.8 million ballots on election night. The size of our county is rivaled only by the complexity and diversity. Currently, we provide language assistance in more than a dozen languages and serve multiple communities representing a broad spectrum of socioeconomic conditions, high rates of mobility, and residential status. I firmly believe that good governance begins with good elections. The way an election is conducted in terms of voter access, process transparency, and systems accuracy and integrity affects the voter trust in government and sets the tone for the perceived legitimacy of incoming administrations and, more importantly, the legitimacy of our participatory democratic process. More than 10 years after the 2000 presidential election, the biggest lesson learned is that elections ought to be recognized as a profession of constant innovation. No single policy is absolute, and no best practice stays fresh. Moving forward, election officials and policymakers must adopt new models that take a balanced, voter-centered approach and that consider the voter needs and habits, plausible technologies, and data as the prime factors to elections innovation and improvement. In my 20 years as an election official, I'm the first to admit that as a profession and as a government, we have often failed to put the voter experience at the center of our consideration and acted with little data, instead driven primarily by political pressure and operational convenience. If we hope to improve the experience of voting of our current and future voters, it's imperative that we avoid reacting solely to remedy inefficiencies and inadequacies of current processes, but instead seek to create the conditions and garner the resources to continuously improve the voter experience, and therefore begin to remedy the broader issues of declining voter participation, a cumbersome voter registration system, and inadequate voter education. This will only be possible if the election official in the 21st century manages elections through a voter-centric lens and data-driven management and modernization initiatives. To put that into context, let me suggest 3 priorities and some practical examples where we've experienced some success. First, in the area of data-driven management. The richness and availability of data to help analyze and manage our processes is an all-time high. Building the skills and tools to integrate the utilization of data into the organizational structure of elections administration is critical. In Los Angeles County, doing so has assisted us in prioritizing and targeting multilingual services, developing formulas for the allocation of voting devices and poll workers, and meeting the demands of increasing vote-by-mail activity. Second is a collaborative model of elections administration. Elections are a public process that does not belong to the election administrator. Fair, accessible, transparent, and effective elections require citizen participation, not just at the ballot box on election day, but throughout the process. Los Angeles County has experienced great success in building partnerships with advocacy organizations, the elections integrity community, and other governmental agencies to increase transparency in the elections process through a poll monitoring program, initiatives to increase and maximize voter outreach and education, and most recently to envision the future of our voting systems. Los Angeles County strives to be a model for what voter-centered innovation can look like. Plagued by a stalled voting system market and an aging voting system, in 2009 we launched a voting system project that set out to transform the market as we know it by implementing a process that seeks to redesign the voting experience through voter input and stakeholder participation, and that envisions development and implementation of an open voting system that elicits public trust and encourages greater participation. The third priority, convergence of technology and process. Voter registration modernization is the most common denominator in looking at improving the voter experience. It drives the resource needs for elections and is vital to facilitating participation. Online voter registration has been a game changer, but it is not the end of modernization. We need to move ahead with efforts to securely match data across jurisdictions and agencies, to improve the accuracy of our voting rolls, to identify eligible, unregistered citizens, and to provide a seamless process for voters to ensure their eligibility and participation. Finally, I believe it is important in any discussion about the voting experience that we reflect on the sustainability and flexibility of our systems and processes. Much time and many resources have been devoted in recent years to looking back at past voting experiences to identify lessons and to make improvement, while little has been explored in terms of prospective issue identification and proactive development for the future. It is incumbent upon us to look forward and to anticipate the impacts of evolving changes in demographics, technology, and voter expectation. Any investment of time and resources in responding to the experiences of voting in 2012 must allow the flexibility to anticipate the voting experience and expectations in 2014, 2016, and beyond. Based on 2010 census data, the two fastest growing populations in Los Angeles County are those over the age of 65 and those between the ages of 18 and 29. Recognizing that dynamic, we must be mindful of both the experiences and images of the senior waiting in line to vote in 2012 and of the young teen sitting in a classroom today who will be a first-time voter in 2016. Good governance begins with good elections, and good elections begin with the stability in governance, and innovation in process, and a commitment to the voter experience. That is the 21st century challenge to election officials and to voters. I thank you again for the opportunity to be here, and I thank you for your service to the President and to our country.
Next is Steve Trout, the Elections Director in Oregon.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the Commission. Steve Trout, State Election Director in Oregon, and really appreciate the opportunity to come and testify before you this morning. It'll come as no surprise that I'm here to advocate the merit of vote by mail that we've had in Oregon exclusively for over 13 years now. And I think when you look at the charge that's been given to this commission, vote by mail solves half of those problems just through the vote by mail process. Obviously, there's no lines with the vote by mail process. I think we've proven that the system is more secure because we're checking every single signature of every voter that returns a ballot. And that helps us to know that they are eligible and registered. And one of the things that we've just recently learned looking at, as we've done the cross-state check that Secretary Gessler was talking about, is that oftentimes, and this was my experience in non-vote by mail states where we had polling places, that when you go to issue voter history after the election where people sign into the logbooks, a lot of times the barcodes they'll shoot the wrong barcode and voter history will get put to the wrong person, and that can adjust the rolls and have a negative impact there. But with vote by mail, we know every person that votes, we verify every signature, and so I think we have a lot better data for each individual, as Dean was talking about. It's convenient and easy for the voters. They can go at their own pace. And it's much more forgiving. So, one of your charges is, contingency plans for natural disasters. If there's a wildfire or earthquake or tsunami or any of the various natural disasters that we could have in Oregon, or just power outages or a wreck on the interstate, we can always go and take our ballot the next day, and it gives us flexibility. If you know a storm's coming, that you can go and drop your ballot off beforehand, and it's not one day that all the election activities have to happen. We spread it out over 2 weeks, and so that gives us more flexibility. But it's also more forgiving in the instance where the wrong ballot gets delivered to someone. I mean, we've been doing elections, all of us, for a long time, and know that we're not perfect in printing out ballots and getting them to the right place. And so with vote by mail and being able to spread that out over a 14-day period, if by some chance a certain precinct got a ballot with the wrong contest on it, there's time to go back and correct that and issue a new ballot, void the old one, and be able to have procedures in place to make sure that no one's going to be able to have more than one ballot count. But to be able to have that flexibility to make sure that we get the right ballot to the right person and that they have time to return and deliver their ballots. One of the great benefits, I think, for vote by mail is increased turnout, especially in the non-even numbered November elections. So, for example, for our presidential primary last May, our election was the same day as both Idaho and I believe Kansas, both of which had a contentious, or Kansas I think had a contentious Senate contest, and we were 15 points higher in turnout than either of those. We had 40% return, which still isn't the greatest, but a lot better than 25. And in some of my times in California, I can remember having a 9% turnout. And so I think having increased turnout really helps, especially with talking about ballot simplicity. I think we've seen a trend over the last decade, especially with cost increasing, that more and more local jurisdictions and small jurisdictions try to consolidate their elections with the statewide because it's cheaper for them, which is causing our November even year ballots to be longer and longer, which it's more and more complex, longer for the voters to go through and study the issues, and then just even if they've studied it beforehand, longer to go through in a polling place or at home and actually mark the ballots. I think the greatest concern for election administrators is that there's so many things on the ballot that it goes to a second card, which in effect causes twice as much work because it's just like doubling the turnout. So I think with the increased turnout in vote by mail elections, that it's allowing we're not having as much movement to those November even numbered years, and it's helped trying to spread the elections out over time. Clearly, there are many concerned about the future of vote by mail and issues with the post office, and we have developed a wonderful working relationship with the postal officials in our state, and continue to work with them in anticipation of whatever changes may happen. But honestly, I think the next big step in vote by mail elections is for voters to be able to download their ballot from home or have it emailed to them, and then to print that out, mark it out, and send it home. I'm not talking about internet voting. I'm talking about voters going someplace else to receive their ballots. Some people say, well, what if it gets tampered with and the wrong ballot comes to them? We have that same problem now with paper that's being mailed. So I really don't see that there's a lot of risk there, and that the risks are manageable, and that whether it's 3 years down the road, 5 years down the road, 20 years down the road, I think that's the next logical step for vote by mail. So one of the other big ones, and I mentioned it earlier, is our voter rolls are very clean relative to others that we've worked with. When we did this cross-check, over 90% of the duplicates, the active voter was in Oregon, and the cleanup needed to happen in the other state. And I attribute that to the fact that we're mailing a ballot to every registered voter, every active registered voter, at least twice a year. And so we're getting that information back from the post office when they move, so we can inactivate people, use current technology to try and track them down and learn where they have moved, and be able to manage those lists effectively. So I think in a vote by mail state that there is a definite incentive to have your rolls clean, because you're spending money for every ballot you mail out. And you don't want to mail a ballot out to somebody that doesn't live there anymore, because in effect that ends up costing you 3 times. The first mailing out to the wrong address, the return postage coming back to you to say they don't live there anymore, and then a third mailing to the correct address. And so we really have an incentive to do that, and have I think that's another big value of vote by mail. And finally, looking to the future, we need to change the way that that we select and have voting systems. Technology is changing too fast. The public demands current tools and services, and we need to be able to keep up with the advances of technology. That's one of the things that led us to our implementation of using tablets for accessible voting in Oregon, and knowing that those tablets have the most state-of-the-art accessibility tools, and that they are continually updated through that system, and that we're able to use the most current technology. And our use of these accessible tools caused a 2,000% increase in the number of voters with accessibility needs that utilize the system. So we really feel like we're taking the ballots to the people and helping them to be able to cast a ballot. I look forward to your questions, and again, thank you for the opportunity to testify this morning.
Thank you very much. Next is Maggie Oliver, the County Clerk and Chief Election Officer from Bernalillo County, New Mexico.
Good morning. Honorable Chairman and members of the Commission, my name is Maggie Toulouse Oliver. I'm the elected County Clerk and Chief Election Officer of Bernalillo County, New Mexico. It's my honor to be here today on a panel with my fellow election administrators. Bernalillo County is located in the north central region of New Mexico. It encompasses the Albuquerque metropolitan area. It's a majority minority, ethnically and culturally diverse area with both urban and rural populations. It is home to 662,000 individuals and approximately 432,000 registered voters. Among the state's 33 total counties, Bernalillo County alone accounts for approximately 1/3 of the state's voting populace. I've been the county clerk in Bernalillo County for 6.5 years now, and I'm proud to say that we have made enormous strides in election administration during that time. So I'd like to speak on a number of topics today, but given the time constraints, I'm going to focus my testimony on what I think was a great success in the 2012 election cycle, in which my staff and I implemented vote centers to improve efficiency, streamline costs, and vastly improve the overall voting experience for voters in my community. In short, we were able to consolidate over 400 individual precincts into 69 locations countywide. Each one was open to every voter of the county. We reduced our election day poll worker needs by 2/3. We saved $1 million over the course of an election year, and when your total budget is around $5 million, $1 million is hugely significant. And we received immense positive feedback that well over 90% of the voters were happy and satisfied with the new voting experience. So before I get into some detail on the vote center process, I want to briefly discuss the path that we traveled to arrive at this new way of implementing elections. With each election cycle since I came into office, we've worked to improve the process. With the advent of paper ballots in New Mexico in late 2006 came great challenges and opportunities. And so after trying one election cycle using pre-printed ballots for early voting, in 2010 in Bernalillo County, we implemented ballot on demand at our early voting sites. And that's the use of electronic poll books combined with the printing of ballots right on site. Let me briefly touch on early voting in New Mexico and Bernalillo County. The success of our election process is heavily dependent on early voting. Beginning 28 days before the election, a voter can cast an in-person ballot at a county clerk's office across the state. And beginning 3 Saturdays before the election, they can vote in person at satellite sites across the county. In Bernalillo, we use 17 total sites, which is 2 more than is required by statute because it works. And we keep our early voting sites open 12 hours a day, Monday through Saturday. And while this is challenging in terms of staffing, we find it invaluable in providing a great convenience to the public, in addition to improving our ability to successfully administer the voting process, as in 2012, over 70% of our ballots in Bernalillo County were cast before Election Day. And so with the use of ballot on demand at our early voting locations and the knowledge that we could potentially successfully implement such a system on Election Day, I and my fellow county clerks advocated for the passage of legislation in 2011 that would allow for bringing the convenience of countywide early voting to Election Day itself. Immediately after that legislation took effect, my team and I undertook rigorous research. We traveled to neighboring states to observe smaller scale vote center elections. We engaged in widespread community outreach, including stakeholder meetings and public forums, and we drafted an extensive background and implementation plan. So I'll briefly walk you through how vote centers have been implemented in Bernalillo. As a statutory basis, we are required to locate one vote center within each 10 contiguous geographic precincts. We may then overlay our early voting locations. And further, after soliciting feedback, my staff and I added additional sites based on geographic and voter turnout considerations. Essentially, we didn't want any voter to have to travel more than 2 miles to any polling location within the county. We utilize primarily public schools, especially high schools, as election day vote centers for a number of reasons, including their proximity to major thoroughfares, their geographic distribution, ADA compliance, and the availability of space and parking. This, of course, brings the additional challenge of coordinating with the schools, but the Albuquerque Public School Administration and staff have been willing and cooperative partners in this effort, and they've gone above and beyond to accommodate our needs. In addition to having conveniently located and a geographically widespread coverage of polling locations, it was necessary to implement the ballot-on-demand technology that I mentioned earlier at every polling location on Election Day. This required a detailed and coordinated effort among IT staffs. There was extensive evaluation and testing, planning and implementation done to ensure that all sites would be operational on Election Day, that backup systems were in place in case of a loss of internet connectivity, and that sites could continue to process voters in the event of a backup failure. The sites were all securely interconnected, preventing double voting and ensuring that voter records were flagged when the voter was issued a ballot. Despite our extensive planning, the system could not have worked without a robust voter education campaign and some key voting information tools. Our office utilized some of the $1 million in cost savings to implement an award-winning voter education campaign, which included TV, radio, internet ads, billboards, and direct mail to every registered voter in the county. Further, we implemented our My Voter Information internet tool, which allows voters to log in to receive customized voting information, including detailed personal voter registration data, representative districts and links, a sample ballot, and information about how and where to cast a ballot closest to the voter, either by absentee, early, or Election Day. For in-person voters, we also offered the My Vote Center app for mobile devices, which provides maps and directions to the polling location nearest the voter at any point in time. Additionally, both My Voter Information and the My Vote Center app listed wait times for both early and Election Day polling locations, allowing voters to plan ahead of time which location they wanted to visit. And I should mention the wait time feature was also crucial to the implementation of Election Day vote centers because it allowed us as administrators to help direct traffic, and it also gave voters the tool, the information in advance to be able to determine where they could go to avoid long lines on Election Day. As in past years, in 2012, my office also once again partnered with the University of New Mexico Political Science Department to conduct a 360-degree assessment of the election and its administration. And I believe you've been provided a link to that report. Professor Lana Ackeson's report on the implementation of the election provided my office with both anecdotal as well as data-driven feedback with which to continue our fine-tuning of the vote center process. And I'm hopeful that this report can help guide other jurisdictions in New Mexico as well as elsewhere in the country as they attempt to implement streamlined and convenient voting processes in their communities. Among other things, the report assessed voter feedback through a random survey. Some highlights of the report showed that voters in Bernalillo County experienced, on average, a 5.2-minute wait before receiving their ballot. 92% knew that they could vote at any polling location on Election Day. 97% stated that voting at a vote center was better than voting at their traditional Election Day precinct, and 82% of voters called voting at a vote center easy. I feel confident by the wide variety of measures obtainable that we made the right move in Bernalillo County by shifting to vote centers on Election Day. While I'd caution that vote centers may not be right for every community, I also think that by extensive planning and coordination, many of the locations that may have experienced problems with traditional election management or vote centers in the past could realize successful implementations moving forward. Further, many of the tools and planning processes that my staff and I utilized in 2012 can be replicated just about anywhere. So once again, Mr. Chairman, members of the Commission, I humbly thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today, and I will gladly stand for any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We would like to turn now to questioning by the members of the Commission. Those were all excellent presentations that have given us a lot of material to think about, so we thank you for that. Who would like the first question?
Commissioner Patrick. Commissioner Patrick.
Thank you. And thank you all for being here today. It's nice to see old friends. Maggie, I had one question about how you captured the wait time, because that's, of course, something that we've heard a lot of different ideas on how to do it best. Do you do it for the amount of time that the voter has to stand in line before they first get to an election person and first sign in? You know, what exactly is the wait time? Is it the entire process of casting the ballot? So I'd like to hear just a little bit about how you captured that information and how you kept it current so that the voter had the most recent information when they were trying to make the determination of where they wanted to go.
Thank you, Commissioner Patrick, for that question. So we had a couple of different measures. In terms of the UNM study, the measure was a self-determined measure. So in the survey, the voter was asked, you know, how long did you stand in line? And so they made a self-determination about how long it felt to them. I'm sure not every voter that answered the survey, you know, timed themselves. In terms of how we implemented the wait time app, however, we had a feature implemented with our ballot on demand vendor. And so we had a designated individual at each polling location that basically was required to, when a timer would begin. And when they saw a person at the back of the line, when that person came up to the front of the line, they would hit the timer again. So we would know how long it was taking to process X number of individuals. In vote centers, at least in my experience, our bottleneck was in the issuance of the ballot, checking in the voter, you know, looking them up in the system, issuing them the ballot. We did not have bottleneck in terms of voting booths. We did not have bottleneck in terms of feeding the ballot into the machine. So that was our determinant, and then we converted that data to the online app.
And so when you determined that the person had been waiting for 10 minutes, did you have an input mechanism there at each of the vote centers then where the information was put in?
Right, that's correct.
Okay,
so basically, yes.
Thank you.
Commissioner Thomas.
Thank you all for coming to join us today. Ms. Oliver, I'd like to follow up on your comment. As I understand it, you said about 70% of your voters voted before Election Day. So that would leave 30% that were coming to your vote centers on Election Day. What's your sense of a state that does not have early voting? So with AVs, they may have 70 to 80% of their voters coming to some polling place on Election Day. How do you think vote centers would work in that environment?
Thank you for the question, Commissioner. I specifically mentioned early voting and how we do it in New Mexico and in Bernalillo County because I think that is so crucial to how Election Day, whether it's via vote centers or via traditional precincts, how Election Day voting is implemented. I think that when you have every voter or most of the voters casting a ballot on Election Day, that creates pressure on the Election Day system, no question. That doesn't exist when you have a situation like we do where most of our voters are voting before Election Day. I think with vote centers in a state or in an area where you don't have extensive early voting, I'm not sure you get the bang for your buck. And that's why I think, you know, I made the comment that I don't think vote centers maybe are necessarily right everywhere. Vote centers are great when you can consolidate and you can realize that that streamlining effect and that cost savings. But in a situation like you're describing, you may have to have, you know, and I don't know what size of jurisdiction we're talking here, you may have to have 100 vote centers. And that may not make more sense than just having 150 precincts. So I really think it's got to be situational. Thank you.
Commissioner Grayson.
Dean, you talked about a formula for distributing voting systems and precincts. Could you talk a little bit more about that? That's something that we've been hearing a little bit about, and we're just curious, you know, what were the elements of that? How well did it work or not work? And maybe advice you'd have based upon that for other jurisdictions to implement something like that.
Sure. Thank you for the question. In LA County, sadly, some of the technology we're still using is rather old. So we have a what's essentially a mainframe system that's been built by our own tech team that has a script that we run to, and it has a number of variables involved in it. It depends on the nature of the election. A partisan primary is different than a general election, and that helps us to determine, based on voter registration data, how many booths we need for each political party in a particular precinct. If it's, rather than just doing a uniform allocation that's equal for each party, we base it on the voter registration population. We also build into that formula information about if it's a polling place near or on a college campus, because we know that there's the potential, especially in an even year election, for higher turnout there. And we base it on the voter turnout trends in the particular geographic area too. So it's a number of factors, and it can be manually changed. So we run the formula for 4,800 polling places, but if we know specific data in a particular area, we can go in and manually adjust that as well.
Let's assume that you didn't have the mainframe and you were just designing a formula. Would you do it differently if you were to be able to, from a technological standpoint? Would you add different criteria to it? For example, do you do ballot length and how long you anticipate it might take each voter to cast the full ballot when you do the calculation?
We don't include ballot length in our current configuration. I guess to answer your root question, if I was building a formula for our current voting system, I would do it very similar to the way we're doing it today. But I think that's the other key, is that the voting equipment and the nature of that equipment is another factor that has to be included in that. There are limitations to our current voting system, so the length of the ballot, because we're still on vote recorder devices, isn't going to change the allocation of a voting device, because the devices themselves are all the same.
Commissioner McGann?
Good morning. Question that I had is for Secretary Gessler concerning the high-speed printers that you deployed statewide. Were those operable with all voting systems in use? Just curious how the counties were able to all use that system.
So the answer is yes, they are. Colorado has a very complex system because we use just about every single vendor, and so we have a lot of complexity statewide because of the variability. But they did work with every single one of the vendors to be able to print ballots from those systems. I mean, the challenge we had this last cycle is they were just, because of the way the federal grant process worked, they were deployed pretty late in the cycle. So some counties were able to use them very effectively. Some counties didn't have the resources to, even though they had training, to fully integrate them into their operations on the fly. But we were very happy with them. Every county has them, and they worked very well.
Were you able then to come up with a template or some kind of process so that each county could convert their ballot to be, could function with the printer? I was just curious. I know sometimes there are issues between the private, and this may be getting too into the technical side, but I was wondering if you came up with sort of a common data format so that all the counties could sort of put their ballots in that format so that then the printer would print it out in a consistent way and it could be recognized by the voting system.
Yeah, so the answer to that, right now Colorado is incapable of coming up with a common data format just because we have so many different vendors across the state. So it's on a county by county basis. But the answer is, I mean, we were able to come up with that. Every county was able to, from a technological standpoint, use it. But, a lot of counties, most counties, I mean, they will, for example, contract out their printing. And that contracting process is negotiated months in advance with substantial planning lead times and things like that. So there was already a very, robust process in place to service voters. And then the ballot-on-demand printers were deployed. So some counties were able to fit those into their existing processes, and some weren't able to. I anticipate for the 2013 election, we have one coming up in November, an odd-year coordinated election. And then, of course, the 2014, we'll be able to make far better use of that physical asset than we were last time, just because we have to integrate it into our processes.
Right, okay. Thank you.
I think we just figured out in a display of technological savvy that we cannot have two microphones on at the same time, so the error lies with the commission and not with the technicians. I want to absolve them of any responsibility. Commissioner Mays.
My questions, I have a few for Mr. Trout. We've heard that voters seem to like choice, and yet your testimony here this morning is about vote by mail. And in particular, I'm interested in how you've been able to accommodate voters with disabilities, let's say visual impairment, if that is indeed their desire to vote privately. So what have you done to accommodate those voters?
Thank you for the question, and that's something that we've worked on since the implementation of HAVA and even before that. And so, initially after HAVA, we developed a laptop-based system with all of the screen readers and different functionality for visually impaired and other accessibility needs voters. And had very little use of that, especially in our rural areas. I think we've got 36 counties, and I think in 30 of those 36 counties, they'd never had a voter use that accessible tool. And so as those were beginning to end of life, and we were having to go out before every election and upgrade the screen readers and the different tools, that caused us to look at what other options were out there and what the people in those affected communities were desiring. And what we found at the time was that the iPads were what most of them were using in their day-to-day life to conduct business, to perform their daily activities as an accessibility tool, and those were constantly being upgraded. And so we looked at that and said, well, this is something that we won't have to go out and train people on. It will be easy for voters, it will be easier for election officials, and something that will continually be kept upgraded with the most state-of-the-art operating system and accessibility features. And so we made the decision then to go forward and utilize those tablets. And what we found is that there's not a one-size-fits-all solution for accessibility needs. And in previous experience, this was the accessible voting tool. This is what you'll use. Whether that was an AutoMark, whether that was a DRE, whatever it was. And through using this. Through using these tablets, we were able to enable people to use the tools that they were used to using at home. Whether it was a joystick or paddles, a sip and puff, whatever they were comfortable using, you could plug into these tablets to be able to mark your ballot. And so we tested that with a number of groups, with the visually impaired, with cognitive disabilities, all of the different accessibility groups that we could find. And it's as I said, it really increased the use over 2,000% here in November, and it's enabled and encouraged our county election folks to take these tablets out into the community where the people with accessibility needs are, and they're not afraid to do it anymore. Before, they had to either have two huge suitcases and a bunch of complex templates that laid over the keyboard. Now they can go out with the tablet with a couple of accessibility tools, or let the person use their own and plug it in and be able to mark their ballot. And they have a lot more comfort, and it goes a lot quicker. And it's kind of feeding on itself, the county election officials saying, wow, this is neat to be able to see people vote independently, and we're starting to get the word out to more people. We've tried to, our biggest problem is finding the people that need the service. And so, obviously through the advocacy groups we're working, but now we've started working with those companies that build and sell the assistive devices, figuring, well, if the people are going there to buy these devices, those, that's our market. And so those are the people that we want to be able to vote independently. We know there's some people that never, that are always going to want somebody to help them, and that's okay. But what we've tried to do is provide as many ways for as many different disabilities and opportunities for people to be able to mark a ballot as they can.
And I just have one other question, which is on a different area of this vote by mail. When you look at your remark about voting by mail is more forgiving, that is, if you need to communicate with the voter, do you have a consistent procedure or policy that determines when you communicate with the voter and when you simply void a ballot?
Yes, I mean, we have, I think it's a 98-page vote by mail manual that is adopted. It's an administrative rule that we update every couple of years when the laws change to go through, because we want to have uniformity. That's probably my biggest role, is to try to achieve uniformity in administration of election rules throughout the state. And so we have, if a ballot comes in that hasn't been signed, then the county notifies the voter, and they have until 10, now 14 days after the election to come in and cure that, whether that's a ballot with no signature, whether that's a signature that didn't match. So that's really our fail-safe for any of the ballots that wouldn't be counted otherwise. We reach out to the voters, and there's a specific letter that goes out under specific timelines for their return. And so we try and anticipate all of those contingencies. We do a pretty good job, but as we know in elections, there's always something that pops up that you could have never anticipated or expected, and that's part of the fun of it. But we try to document and have in written procedure as many of those processes as we can to make sure that it's uniform, and that if someone were to challenge it, we could go forward and say that. For instance, we had our statute says that ballots need to be mailed during a 4-day window, 18 to 14 days before Election Day. Some people interpreted that to be that the post office couldn't deliver them until beginning on the 18th day. Some people interpreted that as you can't deliver them to the possession of the post office until the 18th day. So, the issue there is if you give it to the post office and they accidentally mail them out early, people in one county end up with 2 or 3 extra days to cast their ballots as opposed to their neighbors. And so we've been trying to eliminate any of those distinctions and make sure that we've got a uniform application and uniform understanding. And so those are the kind of things that we issue in that manual or by directive.
Thank you. Commissioner Thomas, then Commissioner McGeehan, and then Professor Pursley.
Now, Mr. Trout, I thank you for your innovations. Can you just explain a little bit how the disability voting works? Are they driving to a location? Are they doing it from home? And what plans do you have down the road for further innovations with that population?
So yes, and we've had the ability for people to be able to mark their ballots on their home computers or home systems, whatever they have, and then mail those back in. So we mail every voter in the state a ballot, including those with accessibility needs, but we do have those flagged so that we can help them. We can either email them a ballot, send them a link to where that ballot is, so that they can get it, mark it, and return it just like every other voter does, and we have that paper trail. Others we have, we'll have some voter assistance teams, some of the counties call them, go out to assisted living centers or places where we know there are people with needs to use these accessible tools. And they will take the equipment there on different schedules to the different locations, and we're going to be at this center from 1 to 4 on the 13th, and anybody that wants to come there can do that. Again, I think our emphasis right now is trying to identify those voters that can utilize these tools. I think we've gotten the ones that have used them historically with whatever tool we've put out, but now that we've made it easier and have more tools available, it's about finding those voters that need that assistance. Going forward, I think my objective has been to have one ballot that works for accessible voters, that works for military and overseas voters, any voter, so that we're only proofing one ballot. Everybody gets the same ballot, and it's always accessible. We were able to utilize that technology here with Superstorm Sandy. We had about 40 voters that were stuck on the East Coast that couldn't get back to Oregon to cast their ballots. the weekend before the election. We were able to allow them to go online, download, mark their ballot, and then overnight mail it back to us as long as we received it by the close of polls on election night. They were able to cast a ballot that they otherwise wouldn't have been because we were able to provide this ballot to anybody, anywhere. And I think that's the wave of the future. I think that we have enough tools and technology there to be able to make sure that people are not going to be able to cast more than one vote. I think that's a lot of times the concern. If there's a ballot printing error and so a county ends up sending out replacement ballots in the mail, it's like, well, how do we know that they're not going to be able to count twice? We track all of that. Everything's tracked through that, and we need to do a better job at educating the public that we have all of these procedures and processes in place to make sure that no one can cast more than one ballot. I mean, really, it shouldn't matter if I could go out and print 6 million copies of my ballot. I have confidence that the procedures in place are going to make sure that only one ballot that I cast is going to be counted.
Commissioner, go ahead, please.
So when the voter is voting from home, they're printing a ballot off, or they mark it on their system, print it off and mail that to you. Is that what you're counting, or are they sending back an electronic? And if you are counting the paper, do you then have to duplicate that onto a regular OpScan ballot or
Yes, so
whatever?
they're printing it out on their own printer. When we go out into the field, we've got a little portable $60 printer that we take with it that just prints it out. It's not a machine readable ballot, so it does have to be duplicated. One of the things that I think the next step is as we move to digital vote tally systems is that we shouldn't need to duplicate that. Any of these ballots should be able to be printed out and be able to be scanned with a digital scanner and no longer need duplication because, I really think that will really change the way ballots are counted because, as I see it, you could print out an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper with a barcode on it with that captures all of your choices, but then also a printout by name or yes, no on a measure so that you can see what the contents of what that barcode are so that you could go back and check that in a recount or in an audit, a post-election audit to make sure that what's contained in that barcode is actually what's printed on those papers. So that would guarantee you would never have another two-card ballot and would reduce there would be very few ballots then that would ever have to be duplicated. And I think that would be a huge innovation and move forward for elections administration.
Commissioner McGinn.
Dean Logan, I had a question for you about your poll monitoring program. It sounded very interesting as far as, having poll watchers or election monitors work with the county and help you all as sources of information. I was curious if you could tell us a little bit about, is the county, do you require folks to register with you before they can monitor the polls, and what kind of education you do for that group?
Great, thank you very much for that question. That's a program that we're particularly proud of. The history of that program it dates back to the 2004 election cycle, where we discovered that there was this pattern of different groups going out and doing poll monitoring in LA County. They would gather a lot of data, so it goes back to my bias towards data-driven information, and then they would write reports and they would come and present those to the County Board of Supervisors sometimes 2 or 3 months after the election. And it was really good data, really good information. But what we kind of sat back and looked at and said, look, we have 4,800 polling locations spread out over 4,000 square miles in LA County. I can only put so many people out there to visit those polling places. So if there's this army of other people out there that are visiting our polling places, then we ought to be partnering with them. And so we brought them together. We incentivized it by providing training for them to give them information about, they were able to go through the poll worker training, so they had all the same information the poll workers did. We did a demonstration of the voting equipment. We set up a separate phone line and email system that was exclusive to the poll monitoring program, so they didn't have to go through the main switchboard to get in touch with us. We told them we were fine with them collecting their data and going to the board to present that at whatever time in the future they wanted. All we asked for in exchange is when you see something, this is going to sound familiar to those of you who travel, but when you see something, say something, that if you will call us, the earlier we know about something on election day that's happening, the quicker we can respond and hopefully correct that from occurring. So California has a very open and transparent election process. We do not require people to participate in that program. We try to incentivize them through the training and through the direct access on election day. It's been incredibly helpful. I mean, it really has helped us in terms of early identification of issues, and again, it doesn't change the fact that some of these groups have very specific things that they're looking for and that they want to report on, but they're now kind of have a broader perspective, and if they see something that's unusual, they call us and we're able to respond to it.
Thank you. It sounds like a great program.
Thank you.
Commissioner Lomax, and then Professor Persley.
Dean, you mentioned that the voter experience is kind of where you focus your attention. A large part of the voter experience is the equipment on which they vote, and I know you've got some really innovative ideas in this area, especially since a large part of our country is going to have to go out and buy some new stuff here shortly. Could you just talk to us a little bit about what you're doing and your thoughts in that area?
Sure. Thanks for that question as well. That's the biggest thing, the biggest priority of my office right now, and we're in a very unusual position in LA County in that we have a very outdated voting system. By and large, the voting system that we use today is a modification of the voting system we used in 1968, when it was groundbreaking in LA to go to punch card voting. So the equipment literally looks and feels the same as it did then. It just uses ink instead of punching a hole. We know that we're at the end of that life cycle of that voting system, both the voting devices and the vote tabulation system, which is something that was built in-house in LA County. The reality is the market today, in terms of available systems on the market that are certified at the state and federal level, there is nothing that has the capacity to meet the needs of LA County given our demographics. So we stepped back from that in 2009 and said, if that's our reality and we know we're going to have to make an investment of public money in a new voting system, let's try to do this right. Let's try to go back and not have a voting system that is designed to the desires and the needs of us as election administrators, but to go out and, again, gather data from voters through surveys, focus groups, and anticipate what the future needs of voters are going to be. So we did that. We spent 2 years gathering a lot of data, and we talked to current voters. We asked them what do they like about their current voting experience, what do they wish would be better. We talked to young people who are not yet voters and said, what are your expectations going to be when you become a voter? And again, we struggle with this dynamic of trying to serve two very fast-growing populations, the 18 to 29-year-olds and the voters over the age of 65. We've now taken all of that data along with a set of 14 guiding principles that were adopted in collaboration with a vast stakeholder group, and that's included, I believe, in the material that I submitted to you. And we've gone to a human-centered design firm, IDEO, in the Bay Area, and said, take all this data, take all this input and these principles and come back and show us a picture of what a voting experience could look like in that. We didn't ask them to design a voting system. We just asked them to show us what the configuration of voting could look like in LA County in a way that would meet current needs, but also would have the flexibility to meet future needs as well. And we said that it can't just be a pretty picture. It has to be a picture backed up with feasibility studies that says this is something that can be built and can be designed. We're midway through that process right now. We just got the first preliminary concepts from that design process here in the last couple of weeks, and we're moving forward to refine that. But there's a lot of clear patterns that are developing in that. It's clear that, and I think one of the other speakers referenced it, it's clear that the voters today and certainly in the future are going to expect options. Voters want to be able to cast a ballot when, where, and how they're ready to do that. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's on a Tuesday between 7 in the morning and 8 o'clock at night. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's someplace that's within a 2-block radius of their house. For some voters, it might mean that, but there's a wide range of needs and desires, and we're seeing changing patterns in terms of behavior and this goes to some of what you've heard about vote centers and vote by mail. Vote by mail, in my experience, evolved through voter behavior on the West Coast. In Washington, Oregon, and California, it was made available and it grew as voters started to adopt it. I think that's going to be true of innovations like vote centers and changes in the time frames in which we vote. It's going to start slow. We may have to, in a large jurisdiction, if we're going to go to vote centers, we may have to have vote centers while we still have the neighborhood polling places until the voter behavior shifts to a point where it makes more sense to shift to the vote center. So all of those things are being considered. I guess the main emphasis of our project is that we want the focus to be on the voter, and we want technology and process to respond to the needs and the behaviors of voters rather than the opposite, which I think has been the past trend.
Thank you. Certainly.
Dean, the concept drawing that you have, is that publicly available, or is it or at what point, maybe a better way to say, at what point could you share with us sort of a schematic of what this voting system of the future might look like? Because I'd be fascinated to see it, and I think the rest of the commissioners would be as well.
Sure, it's absolutely available. Again, it's fresh. We just had it in the last couple of weeks, so we just presented it to our stakeholder, our CEO, and to our technical advisory committee. So I can get it into a format and send it to you. We've been very clear in this project that we want it to be transparent. So everything related to the project is available on our website. The main thing that I want to couch that in is that these are concepts. They aren't going to be the final product, and they're beautiful pictures, but these things have never been built, so they look like something is real, but they're not real yet. So
was the initial feedback at least positive when somebody saw that, like, yeah, that's sort of what we were hoping, or was it negative, or was it uncertain?
I'm encouraged by the feedback we're getting. To be blunt, honest, when we presented it to our stakeholder committee and our technical advisory committee, I had a lot of anxiety the night before those meetings because I didn't know what to expect, and I was very pleased to see that again, the things that are coming out of the design process are things that relate to the principles and to the data, and I do think that we're starting to narrow in and see where things should be headed. So I'm encouraged.
Professor Pursley?
As long as we're on data requests, let me throw a few out there, which is if you could provide the survey also, if that's on the website, the survey data that you use to do, that would be great. And the other is the algorithm that you're using that we talked about before with respect to resources, if that, or even if it's just the variables, since we're getting a lot of discussion about that, if you could provide that to us, that would be very helpful.
Sure, and I anticipated that question and actually talked to my staff. Right now, it's a bunch of lines of code that would not make sense, so we need to put that into a narrative form, and we'll do that.
Great.
And get it to you. I did want to, since you brought that up, I did want to go back to Commissioner Grayson's question because you had asked about the length of the ballot, and while that's not a factor in it, the nature of the ballot is. So if we know that there is a very high-profile contest in a particular area, that's a factor that we put into effect compared to an area where we have all unopposed candidates or something of that nature.
I've still got some other data requests, if we can, which is if for Secretary Gessler, one of the hardest things we've found to study is the effectiveness of voter education. It sounds like you did a big job in terms of educating people about online voter registration, some of the other features. If there's any studies available that you've done, sort of analyzing the effectiveness of any of those tools, I think it would be really useful to have them. For Steve Trout, if we didn't really talk about signature matching, and if you have data on the lost votes due to signature mismatches, as well as how you follow up with that, and whether you allow the voters to cure those problems, that would be useful to have. For Maggie Oliver, if the, and this I guess I might require a response now, which is, there was a 5-minute average wait time. What was the longest time that someone had to wait in the county, and do you know what distinguished those polling places from the others? And related to that, if we could also have the wait time data, that would be great too.
Sure, was that a question?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. To be honest with you, I don't know off the top of my head what the longest wait time was. I know that we did have a couple of sites in the county that did get very heavy turnout on election day, that despite our best efforts to guide people different directions, they just would rather stay there. So, we'll have a couple of, outliers, maybe even an hour-long kind of outliers, but we can definitely provide you with that data. We have all of that data. We collected it through this app that I was describing to Commissioner Patrick, and so we know how long, in an X minute time frame, how many people we processed, and that's how we know what the wait time was, so we can provide that to you.
Commissioner Britton and then Commissioner Thomas.
First thing I have to say is how extremely impressed I have been in listening to not only your testimony but responses to the questions from the commission. I feel that if you four were indicative of the voting process across our country, we probably wouldn't have this commission. But let me ask a question directed mostly to Secretary Gessler, and anybody else can chime in. Sort of a more philosophical question. We have seen throughout the time since the commission's been formed some various levels of involvement, engagement in governments from the state office level, from a hands-off, more decentralized approach to a somewhat more directive approach. And so I'm just wondering, Mr. Secretary, do you have a philosophy that you think works the best, or something you might recommend to the commission on an approach on how the state should be engaged in voter administration?
Certainly. Had to turn on my mic there. Of course, I think different conditions exist in different states, but the trend that I see is that elections have become far more complex. Over the last decade, we've seen an immense increase in the complexity. Whether you're talking about the MOVE Act, some of it's imposed by the federal government, MOVE Act, HAVA, UOCAVA requirements, things along those lines, and some of it is states imposing it upon themselves. When you have more complex systems, the greater complexity, the more specialization you need in that. And so one of the things is, if you look at traditionally, how elections work in our country, they're built upon either, well, in the West, certainly on the county system, and on some of the East Coast jurisdictions, municipality system. But, I'll have counties in the state of Colorado that have maybe 1,000 residents, okay, maybe several thousand residents, very small election staff. Yet they have to interpret and apply a whole array of, federal statutes, state statutes, complexity, have to provide a lot of stuff, which requires a lot of specialization with a very small staff. Other counties, which will have much larger staffs, are able to build that expertise over time, but many counties aren't. And so I think what you're seeing, and where we're moving towards in Colorado as well, is more towards uniform systems. And we're very much pushing that approach in Colorado. We have 4 different vendors, and those vendor systems are implemented in different ways in counties. And what winds up happening is we have a lot of increase in complexity. It's a lot more difficult to measure and compare and create baselines for performance. And then if there's a problem in one county, it's very, very difficult to move resources to have another county assist them, or to have this expertise in the state level to deploy, because we can't know everything about every system in the way they're done. So I think just sort of that trend creates, for better or worse, an impulse or a drive towards more uniformity, and oftentimes towards more centralization. Some states like Georgia, for example, they, in a centralized fashion, design all of their own ballots. And there's strengths in that, because then you can have 1 or 2 people who spend all of their time thinking the most efficient types of ballot design, as opposed to, in my instance, having to disperse that knowledge across 64 counties, including many people who have to wear a lot of different hats within that county. So So I think that's what you're seeing nationwide. That's certainly what we're seeing here in the state of Colorado. You know, of course, we want to allow local officials to be responsive to local needs, but ultimately, you know, the complexity is just driving a requirement of specialization to thoroughly understand the legal framework, understand the technological framework, and be able to apply that in an effective, consistent manner.
Let me just add, some of my my experience too. I started out as the election lawyer for the California Secretary of State. And, did that for about 4 years, and felt like I had a pretty good grasp on how elections were administered. Then I went to the county level, and realized how much I didn't know, and how much it had to be integrated. And then when I went back to the state level, I've been much more effective and better now knowing those county-specific moods. On the same hand, there's people at the county levels that don't understand the state perspective and the things that have to go on at the state. So there has to be a partnership. We can't succeed without each other. And, I've been in situations where the counties and the state were at war, and that's a lose-lose. I've been in situations where the counties and the state work hand in hand, and obviously that's the best scenario. But I think we have to continue to look at, the impacts that a state policy may have on the day-to-day operations of a county. But I also think as we incorporate more technology and there's more legal challenges and legal considerations and challenges to uniformity, that we really have to take a look at how those responsibilities are balanced. We're still working on the model from 40 and 50 years ago. But I think especially as costs are allocated amongst state, counties, districts, localities, I think it's time to open that back up and see how that should best be distributed. Because it is much more cost effective for me at the state to administer a UOCAVA solution than it is for each one of my 36 counties to develop a solution to serve those voters. But right now, the cost models don't favor that. And so that's just one example. I think that as we use more technology and have more legal attacks, that's a too strong a word, legal issues to address, that I'm a lawyer, and that we need to relook at how those intergovernmental operations are working. We all know that if one of my counties doesn't get their UOCAVA ballots out before 45 days, it's not going to be them that get sued, it's going to be me, rightly or wrongly. And VRA issues. And so all of those are out there that I think we need to relook at the balance of responsibilities and costs at all levels of election administration, state, county, local, and district.
Thank you. You weren't looking at Mr. Ginsburg and me when you were talking about legal attacks, were you? Okay, good. I was just checking. Yeah. Commissioner McGeehan, please. Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay. I had a question for Maggie Oliver. I was very interested to hear about your vote center experience, and there have been some Texas counties that have also had real positive experiences with that. And I was wondering if, in addition to obviously being helpful to voters, giving them that convenience, does it also bring some administrative advantages, so that you can maybe better concentrate on your poll workers, concentrate on getting accessible locations, since you'll have fewer locations. So I was really interested to see does it raise the caliber of your polling place officials? Does it increase ability to get accessible polling places? And does it also help with minority language issues, trying to focus those resources in fewer locations?
Yes. No. Yes to all of that. In fact, selfishly, one of the reasons that my staff and I began looking initially at implementing vote centers was from the administrative perspective and looking to streamline our administrative process. I think Dean was talking about how, with all of, with several thousand polling locations, you can't, have a person everywhere, and so working with these groups that are doing observation helps him to do that. We do a little bit of that too, but with 69 locations, I can have a staff person at every location if I need to. We're interconnected with data, and so we know immediately if there's a problem at a polling location. If we're not getting data back from that polling location, we know right away that we're having issues. We can dispatch somebody out there. We used to have 172 individual locations for our over 400 precincts. Now we're down to 69, so we can address them a lot more quickly. We only use a third of the poll workers that we used in the past, so we can be pickier. We actually we were able to implement screening. And, we hate to do that because we don't want to exclude people, especially who've been very committed public servants who come work the polls year after year. We still have roles for people who maybe aren't, computer savvy or what have you. But we didn't have to be completely stressing out, the week or the days before the election. How are we going to find enough people pulling our hair out? Because we had enough people. And so we were able to do screening, test people for computer skills, say you would be well situated to, be checking in voters. The training we were able to really streamline. We were able to, it's sort of this, debate. Do we cross-train everybody or do we silo everybody? And so we go back and forth quite a bit. Poll worker training is something I've been working on also quite a bit since I came into office. But this last cycle, we did sort of a siloing training. We had people really focused on their roles, training them to their roles. That worked well. We've developed a training curriculum. We've created a training coordinator position. But these are all things we're able to do utilizing this system. That didn't necessarily make sense for us to do in the previous system. So we, as administrators, we love it. We love the data. We love the streamlining.
Okay, we're gradually approaching the conclusion of the panel, but we have Commissioner Thomas and then Commissioners Ginsburg and myself.
This is a real short answer. So what's a long line? So when you do your planning for putting resources out, what should the voter expect as a long line that they should not be seeing? So what do you plan to? And Steve, I already know your answer, and you can answer from your local experience.
2. So I mean, in previous lives, it's. What's the expectation of the voter, I think, is really what it's going to come down to. A 10-minute line may be too long, depending on what those expectations are. But I think this gets back, to some philosophical roots of it's an important thing to cast a ballot, and there needs to be some commitment to do that. But from the election administrator's perspective, you want to be able to anticipate and make that as quick of a time as possible. And I think as we gather more data and are able to track more data at polling places, that will help us to be able to know better what an acceptable amount of time is. And I think honestly between 5 and 8 p.m. It could be over an hour. I know I've waited in line, to ride Space Mountain at Disneyland for an hour and a half, and
But it was well worth it.
It was well worth it. Just as long as it doesn't close right when I get to the front of the line. But it's well worth it to be able to cast a ballot too. And we all hold that precious, and that's why we're here, and that's why we're so committed to this process and making it better. And as we continue to look for ways to improve the processes, the more data we can collect and the more technology we can use, I think the better.
Yeah, I think that's actually a great question. I don't think a lot of people have studied that, and there's been many metrics on that. I mean, my guess in Colorado would be how it's a function of how recently someone visited the Department of Motor Vehicles. So if they've just visited them, they'll be used to a 2-hour line. But if it's been a while, a shorter line. So, I do think I mean, I think that's a valuable inquiry, and I think, from sort of the answer you heard, it's something we haven't really looked at, I think, collectively as a nation very closely. We've looked at it more from an input standpoint, and, there's, obviously different, in my instance, different counties have different approaches. I know we try to keep it to minutes, not hours, of course, and we had some real problems back in 2006 in Colorado along those lines. So we're very sensitive to that. But it would be good to see some more analysis and studies. Should it be the length of a long wait at a grocery store? Is that the standard? I don't know.
As an administrator, you have to draw the line somewhere literally. So we've just chosen 15 minutes because 15 minutes seems like a reasonable amount of time to wait, but not too long. I do think that it's from each individual voter's perspective, it's going to be different. How long is too long to wait? And I know I personally experienced something very interesting in 2008. We opened our first ever early voting site at the University of New Mexico. And our first day of early voting, I went there to do a press conference. I ended up staying the whole day to help manage traffic personally because it was overwhelmed. And we never would have believed it, but the enthusiasm was so great. And everyone that I talked to in line was like, "Isn't this wonderful? So many people are here to vote." I'm like, "You've just been standing in line for an hour and you're super happy." So it really depends on the experience of the voter. I do think it depends on whether the individual thinks it's a function of this overwhelming excitement of voter turnout or whether they think it's because the site's being managed poorly. That has a lot to do with it.
And I'm sorry, just real quick, follow up. We could make anything happen. I mean, we can make the lines 2 minutes if we want to. We can make them 2 hours. But I don't think as election officials, we're the ones that make those decisions. I think what we have to do is to provide the data to say, with these resources, this is what the lines we anticipate they would be during this range, and then leave it to the policymakers to decide what the acceptable wait time is, so that then they can determine how many, what resources they want to allocate to allow us to serve the voters. I think it's a great question, but I think it's probably one that goes to policymakers as opposed to election administrators, because I have faith in my peers that we can make anything happen with the given resources.
So let me just jump in real quick and say that again, I think this is something where data is really important, and I think it's important that we talk to voters to find out what their expectations are. I do think it's contingent. I think it's contingent. If you have a system where voter is choosing from among options for when, where, and how they vote, then I think there's a different level of patience and a different level of expectation about the time of the whole voting experience. And I think, again, maybe we should be measuring the whole voting experience rather than the line waiting to vote. If you're limited to only one option on one day and one time period, then I think the impatience for that wait time period grows exponentially.
We're going to conclude with here a bit of a lightning round. Commissioner Ginsburg.
Thank you, Bob. I wonder if you could all peer into the future. You've all got great systems now, but look out 5, 10, 20 years. And one of the sort of elephants in the room we've been told about repeatedly is the Postal Service. You rely entirely on the Postal Service. Secretary Gessler, you're going to be relying more on the Postal Service. You have a lot of mail-in votes in both of your counties. So the Postal Service is, from what we've heard from election officials around the country, varying qualities. It is also an institution that is cutting back its service locations, cutting back its hours. It is not a business model that is particularly vibrant in the future. So what do you do in light of relying heavily on the post office for voting and the delivery of votes for an institution that's going to look pretty different a decade from now?
Well, and that's a question that we continue to challenge. We've got a great relationship with our local postal officials, but yeah, things are changing, and we are going to have to change with them. In the future, well, right now, already a majority of ballots returned are not returned through the post office. They're dropped off at a drop box somewhere within their community. So I think we're over 60% now. So that that already exists and continues to grow. But I really think the next step, as I talked about a little bit earlier, are voters choosing to opt in to download or have their ballot emailed to them, mark it out, and mail it back. So that will take care of half, the outbound delivery of ballots, and then, would rely on dropping them off at the drop boxes if the post office were to entirely go away. But I think that's going to be something that's going to happen over time. It's not going to be, August 14th, 2018 that the post office closes forever. I think there will be gradual reductions in service as we're already experiencing, and that will help kind of, as Dean was talking about how Vote by Mail was accepted over a period of time as more people gain confidence and trust in that process. I don't know what the number is if I were to go out today and say, okay, everybody that wants to just download their ballot and not receive it through the mail, it could be half the population easily. But there's a core out there that aren't going to want that, and it's going to take time for that to develop over time. So I think, over the period, we're going to have a transition to having more ballot delivery online. Whether that ends up leading, to pure online voting, I don't know yet. That's going to be up to the public on what they will accept.
Basically, I think what we've done in various areas, we're rapidly moving towards a single point of failure in our election systems. And we're building our systems, and we're designing our processes around the U.S. Postal Service. And frankly, we've already seen some of those failures from that single point of failure. I honestly think, in my view, that the most disenfranchised group we have in our country are military voters, particularly our overseas voters. And one of the main reasons for that is because of the U.S. Postal Service and the military Postal Service as well. And we saw in this last election in the large majority of states and nationwide a drop in our military turnout. And I think in part because we have servicemen and servicewomen who are overseas, and they rely exclusively on the Postal Service either to receive their ballot and return them, or at least to return their ballots. And so those systems there don't work. And we're moving towards a single point of failure here in the state, in our country, for our non-military, non-overseas voters. I think we have to be very mindful of that and very careful, particularly if we invest heavily in systems that rely entirely upon Postal Service delivery, and that Postal Service delivery, suddenly the cost skyrockets or the service degrades over time. And we can hope that we'll be able to find additional technology or additional approaches to quickly solve that. But if we standardize on that, on the single point, a critical point, and one that is unstable, I would say, from a business model going forward, we have to be very mindful of that.
So two things I would say. First of all, I don't think we do have great systems today. I think maybe we have great programs that help us mitigate some systems that have severe limitations. So thank you for that. And I just want to say how much I appreciate that question, because I think that is the example of the kind of future focus that has not existed in this dialogue for the last couple of decades. And that's an issue I talk about a lot, because I was a big proponent of vote by mail and championed it when I was in the state of Washington. I don't think it's sustainable over time. I think voter behavior has changed. Young people couldn't tell you the cost of a postage stamp, and they couldn't tell you their mailing address. So it's not going to be a viable option for them moving forward. So I think a combination of the things that you're hearing here, I think a voting period versus a single voting day, voting locations that are that can service all voters within a jurisdiction rather than voters being tied to a specific location, and the ability for voters who want to be able to obtain their blank ballot through electronic means, and to mark that and drop it off at any number of locations. Those are the kind of things that at least the data in our project are showing. But I would also say that I think that there hasn't been a lot of discussion around that question. I think people have buried their heads in the sand around that question. And the final point is that the other piece to vote by mail that I think is vulnerable is that the means of authenticating the voter is exclusively through a signature match. And they're not teaching penmanship anymore, and you look at the quality of signatures, and that's also not sustainable. And again, it's a question that I think people just haven't wanted to look at.
And I would just echo what Dean said, and I would just also add two things. I think as election administrators, we're feeling an intense amount of pressure to use the online tools that are being developed, to use the internet more. Not a day goes by that I don't get asked when we're going to have online voting. Aren't we going to have online voting? And, you know, my hair kind of stands on end. But we do need to be using those tools. And I think, you know, the fact that, you know, the Postal Service is having issues and things like that, we need to figure out ways to use those tools better, more effectively. We can be serving our overseas voters better, utilizing those tools, et cetera. But I personally come from the philosophy that, you know, voting is fundamentally a human and human interactive process at the end of the day. I think it's really important to always maintain that core piece, and there may be voters that we always have to interact with electronically, but I think at the end of the day, you know, I personally would never want to see us move entirely away from interpersonal interaction in voting. I just think it's too important to the integrity of the election process. So that's my 2 cents. Thank you.
I have 2 very quick questions to bring up the end, and thank you for your patience. I know we've kept you somewhat longer than originally scheduled. Secretary Gessler, just a quick question for you, actually 2 quick questions for you. One has to do with the improvement that you saw in UOCAVA participation. How did that break out between military and non-military overseas voters?
I don't have the exact numbers offhand at my fingertips. We can get those for the commission.
That would be very helpful.
They both saw substantial increases.
Okay.
So it was across
So there's not a
the
significant difference between the two that you would